From the www.ancientcode.com website. Humans are the result of artificial engineering, according to ancient texts and science. And this is written by Ivan Petricevic. More evidence has been presented that suggests modern man is not the result of a linear process of evolution, but rather a cyclical creation process, intelligently supervised by beings referred to in ancient times as gods. Ancient astronaut theories suggest that extraterrestrial gods came from the stars and seeded life on Earth, creating modern man. Is it possible, as ancient astronaut theories suggest, that civilized man was created by beings not from Earth, that they helped develop modern man? Is it possible that humans have been on Earth before history is telling us? Mankind has always looked up to the stars. We have always been astonished by the beauties of space. The universe has fascinated mankind throughout history. If one day we manage to create space vehicles good enough for interplanetary travel, breaking the boundaries that hold us to Earth, will we be able to admire the beauty of other worlds, other solar systems, creating colonies on different moons and planets? Isn't this the ultimate goal of mankind? If we dream of this possibility, and if we are working towards developing technologies that would allow us to colonize other worlds, is it not possible that there are beings from elsewhere in the universe who developed similar technologies in the distant past? Many researchers believe our universe is home to numerous intelligent beings. Is it possible that Earth was visited by these beings in the distant past? Is it possible that these intelligent beings had something to do with the abrupt evolution of man, creating mankind and teaching him how to develop as a species? According to many researchers, otherworldly beings instructed man in sciences such as astronomy, mathematics, metallurgy, agriculture, and others. These divine beings restored life on our planet after cataclysmic events in the past, helping our species survive throughout history. Those who are not very familiar with the ancient astronaut hypothesis often ask, is there any evidence of extraterrestrial visitors in ancient times? The answer is yes. In fact, star gods left clues scattered across the planet. Ancient cultures worshipped these sky beings and erected monuments in their honour. All we need do is examine the evidence today in our modern world. It is disappointing that the scientific establishment is extremely fixated on strict doctrines. New discoveries and alternative theories that contradict and put pressure on well-established concepts are by no means welcomed by mainstream scholars. Mysterious discoveries made throughout our planet are considered by some as dangerous, which threaten the orthodox line of history and are tagged as fakes, while other discoveries are simply hidden from the public. Despite recent scientific progress in various areas, it sometimes seems as if we never really left the Dark Ages behind us, since in some areas we remain very close-minded. One of our biggest advances in recent years has occurred in the area of genetic engineering. Today, human beings are masters of genetic engineering and can produce clones that breathe, think, and act like normal humans. Whether this action is ethical or not, that is a question that has been widely debated. Surveys clearly show that most people are definitely against genetic manipulations. But this is not the main issue at this time. What is most important is the fact that we have proven that human beings are capable of creating new life from scratch. Now, if humans can produce new life forms, could the entire human race be a product of genetic engineering by highly advanced extraterrestrial beings? Many of the ancient cultures speak of sky gods. The gods came from the heavens and created mankind. There are hundreds of creation texts around the world, and all of the ancient cultures talk about the star gods who came to this planet and seeded life in the distant past, and helped us develop in a civilized way. We have to take into account that alien genetic engineering offers a solution for the highly abrupt change in human DNA and offers an explanation for the sudden appearance of Homo sapiens. Is it possible that these sky gods manipulated and improved existing species on planet Earth? resulting in the creation of the first primitive forms of mankind, our ancestors. Primitive life forms such as the Neanderthals, Homo erectus and the Cro-Magnon could be considered as extraterrestrial genetic experiments. According to ancient texts such as the Bible, the earth was inhabited by numerous different species in the past, among them the Nephilim. These sacred texts, myths and legends could be interpreted as the alien gods who attempted several times to create intelligent beings. The extraterrestrial gods created a number of human races during different time periods. Some of the genetically engineered creatures possessed the extraordinary wisdom of the gods and could live for hundreds of years. Their power was almost as powerful as the gods themselves. How is it possible to live for 5, 7 or 900 years? There are several mythological stories which often speak of immortal gods. In the eyes of human beings, an extremely long longevity could easily be interpreted as a sign of immortality. The first human race lived longer than modern man of today. A classic example of this enduring humanity can be found in the Bible. Adam, the first man, is said to have lived 930 years. Seth, the second patriarch, lived for around 912. Enosh lived 905 years. Then Enosh lived 815 years after he became the father of Kenan, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enosh were 905 years, and he died. From Genesis 5:11. Kenan lived 910 years. Then Kenan lived 840 years after he became the father of Mahalalel, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Kenan were 910 years, and he died. Genesis 5:14. Mahalalel lived for 895 years. Then Mahalalel lived 830 years after he became the father of Jared, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Mahalalel were 895 years, and he died. Genesis 5:17. Enoch lived 365 years. Then Enoch walked with God 300 years after he became the father of Methuselah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365 years. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Genesis 5:23. Lamech lived for 777 years. Then Lamech lived 595 years after he became the father of Noah, and he had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Lamech were 777 years, and he died. Noah was 500 years old, and Noah became the father of Shem, Ham, and Japheth. Genesis 5:31. So as you can see, sacred texts speak of incredible things that for us today are unimaginable. Today, we know it is not possible for humans to live for 500 years, but in the distant past, this was actually possible. The Popol Vuh, one of the most important ancient texts of the Maya, tells a story of gods who descended from heaven. And as the Bible says, man was created in his image. However, the creation of mankind was not a one-time process, but rather an ongoing process, repeated several times over a long period. Do you think humans are the result of genetic alien engineering? Is it possible to even consider something like this? There are many questions and very little answers. In 1872, the amateur Assyriologist George Smith made a discovery that would shock the world. While studying a particular tablet from the ancient Mesopotamian city of Nineveh, he came across a story that many would have been familiar with. When Smith succeeded in deciphering the text, He realized the tablet contained an ancient Mesopotamian myth that paralleled the story of Noah's Ark from the book of Genesis in the Old Testament. From the ancientorigins.net website, a startling similarity between the Hindu flood legend of Manu and the biblical account of Noah. Today we are aware that flood myths are not only found in Near Eastern societies, but also in many other ancient civilizations throughout the world. Accounts of a great deluge are seen in ancient Sumerian tablets, the Deucalion in Greek mythology, the lore of the Kiche and Maya peoples in Mesoamerica, the Ganyu myth of China, the stories of the Lakota-Oriel's Ojibwa tribe of North America, and the stories of the Muisca people, to name but a few. One of the oldest and most interesting accounts originates in Hindu mythology, and while there are discrepancies, it does bear fascinating similarity to the story of Noah and his ark. The Hindu flood myth is found in several different sources. The earliest account is said to have been written in the Vedic Satapatha Brahmana, whilst later accounts can be found in the Puranas, including the Bhagavata Purana and the Matsya Purana, as well as in the Mahabharata. Regardless, all these accounts agree that the main character of the flood story is a man named Manu Vaivasvata. Like Noah, Manu is described as a virtuous individual. The Satapatha Brahmana, for instance, has this to say about Manu. There lived in ancient time a holy man called Manu, who by penances and prayers had won the favour of the Lord of Heaven. Manu was said to have 3 sons before the flood, Chama, Shama and Yepeti, while Noah also had 3 sons, Ham, Shem and Japheth. In the book of Genesis, the cause of mankind's destruction is given as such. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And it repented the Lord that he had made man on the earth, and it grieved him at his heart. And the Lord said, I will destroy man, whom I have created from the face of the earth, both man and beast and the creeping thing and the fowls of the air, for it repenteth me that I have made them. In the story of Manu, however, the destruction of the world is treated as part of the natural order of things, rather than as a divine punishment. It is written in the Matsya Purana that Manu then went to the foothills of Mount Malaya and started to perform meditation. Thousands and thousands of years passed. Such were the powers of Manu's meditation that Brahma appeared before him. I am pleased with your prayers, said Brahma, and asked for a boon or favour. I have only one boon to ask you for, replied Manu. Sooner or later there will be a destruction, pralaya, and the world will no longer exist. Please grant me the boon that it will be I who will save the world, and it begins at the time of the destruction. Brahma readily granted this boon. In the flood myth from the Old Testament, God who saves Noah by instructing him to build an ark. In the Hindu version of the story, it is also through divine intervention, in the form of the god Vishnu, that mankind is preserved from total destruction. In this story, the god appears to Manu in the form of a little fish, whilst he is performing his ablutions in a pond. Manu kept the fish, which grew so quickly that its body occupied the entire ocean in a matter of days. It was then that Vishnu revealed his identity to Manu, told him about the impending destruction and the way to save humanity. There is also a large boat involved in this story too. Vishnu instructed Manu to build a boat and fill it with animals and seeds to repopulate the earth. O kind-hearted man, you have care in your heart. Listen now. Soon the world will be submerged by a great flood, and everything will perish. You must build strong ark, and take a long rope on board. You must also take with you the 7 sages, who have existed since the beginning of time, and seeds of all things and a pair of each animal. When you are ready, I will come to you as a fish, and I will have horns on my head. Do not forget my words. Without me you cannot escape from the flood. When the time came, Manu was to tie the boat to the horn of the fish, so that it could be dragged around. Interestingly, this would not be the only time that Vishnu saves mankind from destruction, as he would reappear as avatars over the course of time to preserve life on earth. After the flood, Noah's Ark is said to have rested on the mountains of Ararat. Similarly, Manu's boat was described as being perched on the top of a range of mountains, the Malaya Mountains in this case, when the waters had subsided. Both Noah and Manu were then said to repopulate the earth, and all human beings could trace their ancestry to either one of these flood survivors. In 1973, a powerful politician knelt before a former mattress salesman from Tuscany. 10 years later, the mattress salesman simply walked out of a Swiss prison. In 1980, the government of Bolivia was overthrown. 22 years after that, a laptop was stolen in Rome. In 1977, an Italian publishing company was saved from bankruptcy, and 13 years later, the man who financed the deal was hanging from a bridge in London. How could such events be connected? Well, they were all apparently linked to a secret organisation known as Propaganda Due, or P2. History is littered with conspiracy theories, most of them unproven or actively ridiculous. But the P2 was very real, as were the men behind it. From thelistverse.com, a story by Alex Hanton. 10 mysterious men behind history's creepiest, true conspiracy. 10. Michele Sindona. In 1979, Michele Sindona was a desperate man. Despite rumours of his mafia ties and shady dealings, he had risen to become Italy's most prominent banker, even acting as a financial advisor to the Vatican. But he overreached when he tried to enter the American market, overpaying to take control of the Franklin National Bank, which promptly collapsed amid accusations of financial irregularities and outright theft. As the authorities closed in, Sindona tried to buy time by staging his own kidnapping. When that didn't work, he turned nasty. The liquidator of his Italian businesses was shot in the head, and Sindona began hinting that he would name names unless the Italian authorities bailed him out. Nothing worked. He was mysteriously poisoned in 1986, 6 years into his prison sentence. But the Sindona investigation led the Italian authorities to Joseph Crimi, a Sicilian doctor who had assisted with his bogus kidnapping. The police were particularly interested in a trip he had suddenly taken to Tuscany to meet with an obscure businessman named Lychee. In 1981, they obtained a warrant to search Gelli's villa, hoping to find evidence of a connection to Sindona. They found much more than that. In a locked safe, the police found the records of a clandestine Masonic lodge known as Propaganda Due. Its members included 3 cabinet ministers, the son of the last Italian king, and 43 members of parliament. It also included the heads of all 3 Italian intelligence agencies, 213 other senior military officers, and a raft of senior figures in the media and business worlds. It was, it appeared, a state within a state, and its leader was Lychee. Number 9. Lychee. Nobody knows exactly how Lychee gained power, or how he used it once he had it. He was apparently a ferocious anti-communist from a young age. At 17, he volunteered to fight for Franco's fascist forces during the Spanish Civil War. During World War II, he served as a liaison officer to the German SS, gaining a reputation for torturing partisan prisoners. After the war, he possibly helped organise the rat lines that helped wanted Nazis escape Europe. But Gelli was always more complicated than that. After his capture by the Allies, he was saved from execution by a communist partisan leader who claimed that he had secretly been working for the resistance the whole time. During the 1950s, Gelli was sporadically involved in politics, but apparently lost interest and moved back to his native Tuscany, where he became a moderately successful mattress salesman and eventually started his own clothing factory. In secret, however, Gelli was rising through the ranks of Italian Freemasonry. In 1967, he gained permission to start his own lodge, the P2. Through his second-in-command, Umberto Ortolani, Gelli was able to befriend senior figures in the Italian intelligence services who gave him access to their files on prominent Italian citizens. This was fertile blackmail territory, and Gelli revelled in the power they gave him. According to the Socialist Party politician Vanni Nistico, Gelli even produced nude pictures of Pope John Paul II, photographed next to his swimming pool, and ominously remarked, "Look at the problems the secret services have. If it's possible to take these pictures of the Pope, imagine how easy it is to shoot him." From its base in the intelligence community, the P2 Lodge rapidly spread its tentacles into politics, business and the media. Its appeal was clear. The powerful brothers of P2 were pledged to help each other, and membership was a sure route to wealth and influence. And hanging over everything was the threat of Gelli's files and the power of his lodge. Once Gelli clued them into the P2's existence, many prominent Italians simply decided that they couldn't afford not to join. By the 1980s, Gelli was powerful enough to order meetings of Italy's top military leaders at his private villa. By the time his lodge was exposed, Gelli was perhaps the most powerful man in Italy. But what did he want? Was he, as he always claimed, motivated to stop communism in its tracks and save the Italian people from themselves? Or perhaps, as one P2 member later observed, he was a pragmatist without ideals. With hindsight, I realised he has never desired a strong government. In a strong government, mediators have no role. 8. Umberto Ortolani. But P2 activities weren't just limited to Italy. Gelli's second-in-command, Umberto Ortolani, based himself in Uruguay, where he was ambassador for the Knights of Malta and owned a prominent local bank. From Uruguay, Gelli and Ortolani established lodges throughout South America, which was fertile ground for arms trading and money laundering. In Argentina, where Ortolani was a major media tycoon, the P2 apparently helped restore Juan Perón to power in 1973. At Perón's inauguration, former Italian Prime Minister Giulio Andreotti said he saw Perón kneel in front of Gelli. During World War II, Ortolani had been a senior figure in Italian military intelligence, and he maintained strong contacts in the intelligence world. According to the Canadian economist R.T. Naylor, his bank was a key player in a P2 plan to devalue the lira by encouraging capital flight to South America in violation of Italy's currency control laws. When this failed to destabilise the government, the Lodge changed track and focused on constructing a parallel government in which the real power would lie. It has also been alleged that Gelli and Ortolani were in business with Klaus Barbie, the infamous Nazi butcher of Lyon. After escaping Europe at the end of the war, Barbie settled in Bolivia, where he became a major drug trafficker. He was also known to have contacts in Western intelligence agencies and boasted of having planned the military operation that resulted in the capture of Che Guevara. In 1980, Barbie and the Italian right-winged terrorist Stefano delle Kiai were key players in the cocaine coup that briefly overthrew the government of Bolivia. He was deported to stand trial in France in 1983. Number 7. Francesco Pazienza. The P2's influence even extended to American politics. During the 1980 election, the Lodge sought to use its usual dirty tricks against Jimmy Carter, who was considered too soft on communism. In 1985, a Wall Street Journal investigation sensationally revealed that the Lodge had been behind a devastating scandal that emerged at the height of the campaign, probably as part of a larger disinformation scam aimed at affecting the outcome of the election. Earlier in his term, Carter's brother Billy, who was widely considered to be an embarrassment, had courted controversy by accepting a loan from the government of Libyan dictator Gaddafi. The scandal had largely been forgotten, but P2 affiliate Francesco Pazienza made sure it came back. Working with American journalist Michael Ledeen, Pazienza planted a story claiming that Billy Carter had taken yet another loan from Gaddafi. It is also claimed that Billy had a secret meeting with Palestinian leader Yasser Arafat. Billygate became big news again, and Carter's flagging approval ratings took another blow. An Italian court subsequently convicted Pazienza of masterminding the scandal. Ledeen was not charged, but the verdict specifically named him, and he was later accused of accepting $120,000 from Italian military intelligence shortly after the story was published. He denied all charges and eventually rose to a seat on Ronald Reagan's National Security Council. Meanwhile, Lucio Gelli, an obscure Tuscan industrialist, was given an invitation to Reagan's 1981 inauguration. Number 6. Stefano delle Kiai. Probably the most controversial aspect of the P2 Lodge was its alleged involvement with right-wing terrorists during Italy's violent Years of Lead. The most notorious of these was Stefano delle Kiai, who had been accused of involvement in the 1969 Piazza Fontana bombing, the 1980 Bologna station bombing, and a rumoured plan to overthrow the government and replace it with a dictatorship spearheaded by Prince Valerio Borghese. He was certainly involved in the massacre of left-wing protesters in Spain and seems to have worked as an assassin for Barbie while in South America. The P2 are widely suspected of involvement in the Bologna bombing and are usually linked to the Borghese coup plan as well. In 1985, the Italian authorities formally accused Gelli of helping delle Kiai to plan the Bologna bombing, which killed 85 people and wounded around 200. The charges didn't stick against either man, but Gelli and Francesco Pazienza were eventually convicted of deliberately obstructing the investigation into the attack. Gelli was sentenced to 10 years, reduced to 7 on appeal. It was a dramatic sign of how far he'd fallen. Roberto Calvi, number 5. On the face of things, Roberto Calvi was an unlikely candidate for membership in a shadowy illegal organisation. Known as the man with the eyes of ice, he had risen from a lowly clerk to become head of the Banco Ambrosiano, one of the largest financial institutions in Italy. He had a particularly close relationship with the Vatican, hence his other nickname, God's Banker. But beneath the surface, Calvi was a deeply paranoid and insecure man, always in search of powerful patrons to protect him. His earliest mentor was Michele Sindona, who introduced him to the P2. Before long, he was Gelli's most prized asset, an easy source of funding for the P2 and its members. In fairness to Calvi, his desire for a powerful patron wasn't entirely paranoia. He really did need protection from the law. Although Calvi had risen to become head of the bank, he wasn't a personally wealthy man. Yet his pathological secrecy and desire for control meant he couldn't bear to be a simple employee. So for years he had been giving huge loans to overseas ghost companies, which were actually controlled by Calvi. The money would then be transferred to a different ghost company, still secretly controlled by Calvi, who would bring it back into Italy and use it to buy shares in the parent bank. Essentially, Calvi bought control of the company using its own money while increasing profits and share price. The plan was simultaneously brilliantly creative and completely stupid, since it depended entirely on a stable exchange rate. The ghost companies had to operate in dollars, while Ambrosiano shares traded in lira, meaning Calvi was taking dollar loans to buy assets in lira. When the value of the lira fell, the ghost companies made huge losses, and the only way Calvi could hide these losses was to make even bigger loans to the ghost companies. It was a vicious cycle. Additionally, much of the money received by the ghost companies didn't go back into Ambrosiano, but simply vanished. It has been suggested that as much as half of it went to finance Vatican projects, such as Poland's Solidarity trade union, or to bail out other P2 members. By 1982, $1.3 billion had been embezzled through the ghost companies, and Calvi was scared. Number 4. The Rizzoli Family and Bruno Tassentin. One example of how the P2 operated concerned the takeover of the ailing Rizzoli publishing empire. One of the P2 documents found in Gelli's safe was called The Plan for Democratic Revival, and called for the Lodge to infiltrate the three centres of Italian power: the political parties, the trade unions and the media. In order to accomplish the third, Gelli turned his gaze to the Rizzoli Group, which was running huge losses but still controlled numerous newspapers and magazines, including Italy's best-selling and most respected paper, the Corriere della Sera. In 1977, the Banco Ambrosiano suddenly stepped in to save the company from collapse. A more compliant editor was appointed, and the Corriere began to toe the P2 line. In one example, the paper quashed a story that Ortolani's bank was sponsoring Latin American death squads. To celebrate the takeover, Gelli, Ortolani and Rizzoli director Bruno Tassendin gave themselves a $30 million commission on the deal. Meanwhile, Calvi was forced to eat the losses, which only got bigger as Gelli used the Rizzoli Group to buy up newspapers around the country. Gelli got his influence, but the Banco Ambrosiano's situation kept getting worse. Number 3. Paul Marcinkus. In May 1981, Calvi's world finally began to crumble. The P2 had usually sabotaged investigations into Ambrosiano. In one case, the head of the central bank was arrested on trumped-up charges. But the financial authorities were sniffing around again, and once the police opened Gelli's safe, the lodge's days were numbered. Within 2 weeks of the lodge becoming public, the Prime Minister had resigned, a former minister had attempted suicide, and a prominent police chief had shot himself. Gelli made a futile attempt to defend himself in the media, but quickly saw which way the wind was blowing and fled. Vulnerable and desperate, Calvi turned to Francesco Pazienza, paying him a huge retainer for political protection. But in July, the banker was handed a 4-year prison sentence for illegal currency exports. He did not attend the sentencing since he was recuperating from a suicide attempt, possibly staged in an attempt to derail the trial, but possibly real as well. Meanwhile, the ghost companies continued to hemorrhage money. Ambrosiano was close to collapse. But Calvi wasn't done yet. He was allowed to remain free pending his appeal, and Ambrosiano's share price had actually gone up during the scandal. The P2 revelations had apparently convinced investors that Calvi was too well connected to go down. And even though the P2's influence had vanished, Calvi still had a powerful backer: the Vatican. It has since become clear that a significant proportion of the currency illegally exported through the ghost companies went to the Institute for the Works of Religion, IOR by its Italian initials, better known as the Vatican Bank, to support the Church's operations around the world. Calvi was particularly close to the head of the IOR, a tough American archbishop named Paul Marcinkus. In September, Marcinkus gave Calvi 2 letters implying that the Vatican owned the ghost companies and would be responsible for their debts. These letters allowed Calvi to reassure his creditors and stave off collapse. But Marcinkus had a price. He demanded a secret 3rd letter, which absolved the Vatican of all responsibility for the ghost companies or their loans. As Calvi's situation deteriorated, Marcinkus refused to intervene further. A Vatican official told Calvi's daughter she must not mention this name, IOR, even in confession. 2. Flavio Carboni. Before long, Calvi was cracking under the strain. In constant fear for his life, he had started carrying a gun at all times. "Try to understand," he told investigators. "Banco Ambrosiano is not mine. I'm simply in the service of someone else." He implied he might talk to investigators, then changed his mind, apparently out of fear of his former friends. Needing cover, he ditched Pazienza and turned to a sinister Sardinian businessman named Flavio Carboni, who boasted a bad cocaine habit and rumoured mafia connections. In April 1982, a senior Ambrosiano banker survived an assassination attempt in which he was shot twice by a local mobster on his way to work. The money for the hit was later traced back to Calvi. On June 10, Calvi fled Italy. It is not clear what he intended to do, although he told his wife that his accomplices would surely rescue his company and reputation. Otherwise, he hinted he might name names. Carboni arranged for Calvi to be whisked out of Italy by a cigarette smuggler named Silvano Vittor, while Rome underworld boss Ernesto Diotavelli personally provided a fake passport on short notice. Passing through Austria, Calvi and Vittor made their way to London, where Carboni joined them. Calvi evidently spent most of the time complaining about the cheap hotel they were staying in. On June 17, Calvi's secretary apparently committed suicide by leaping out of her office window. A few hours later, in the middle of the night, Calvi apparently told Carboni he was going for a walk. He was found the next morning hanging from London's Blackfriars Bridge. His pockets contained £8,000 in cash and several bricks. His Patek Philippe watch had stopped at exactly 1:52 a.m. God's banker was dead. Number 1. Silvio Berlusconi. The investigation into Calvi's death was not easy. A key suspect was stabbed to death in his home. Another was killed by a car bomb in Rome. The original inquest concluded that the banker had committed suicide, but the case was reopened in 2002, and the death was conclusively demonstrated to be murder. A Scotland Yard detective flew to Rome to investigate, only to have his computer stolen and his files on the case deleted. In 2003, Carboni, Vittor and 3 others were charged with the murder, but all were ultimately acquitted. It remains unclear whether Calvi was killed by mobsters angry about losing money in Ambrosiano's collapse, or by former acquaintances seeking to silence him. Ultimately, as his son put it, Calvi was a dynamic businessman, but not a good judge of people. The other P2 members fared a little better. Umberto Ortolani, Gelli's right hand, initially avoided prosecution in South America, but eventually returned to Italy and was sentenced to 12 years for his part in the Rizzoli and Ambrosiano crashes. He was soon released due to ill health and died in 2002. Francesco Pazienza went to the Seychelles, where he masterminded an embargo-busting oil trade with South Africa. Gelli remained as slippery as ever, escaping a Swiss prison in 1983, insisting that he had found all the doors open for him. He avoided capture for a few more years, but eventually served time for obstructing the Bologna bombing investigation. One P2 member who emerged largely unscathed was a young businessman with political ambitions named Silvio Berlusconi, who would eventually become Prime Minister. Berlusconi has never denied his P2 membership, and it has been alleged that the funds that allowed him to start his media empire came from Ambrosiano. It has also been claimed that Berlusconi's strategy for using his media outlets to support his political career was partially based on Gelli's plan for democratic revival. For his part, Berlusconi has always denied any business dealings with Calvi. He recently completed a year of community service for tax fraud. From the BBC.com, story by Miles Goff. Aboriginal legends reveal ancient secrets to science. The Lychee people, native to the remote areas of Central Australia, once told stories about a fire devil coming down from the sun, crashing into the earth and killing everything in the vicinity. The local people feared if they strayed too close to this land, they may reignite some other worldly creature. The legend describes the landing of a meteor in Australia's central desert about 4,700 years ago, says the University of New South Wales astrophysicist Dwayne Hamacher. It would have been a dramatic and fiery event, with the meteor blazing across the sky. As it broke apart, large fragments of metal-rich rock would have crashed to the earth with explosive force, creating a dozen giant craters. The Northern Territory site, which was discovered in the 1930s by white prospectors with the help of Lychee guides, is known today as the Henbury Meteorites Conservation Reserve. Mr Hamacher, who runs an Indigenous astronomy program at the University of New South Wales, says evidence is mounting that Aboriginal stories hold clues about events from Australia's ancient past. Last year he travelled to Victoria with tsunami expert James Goff, also from the University of New South Wales, to visit members of the Gundit Mara people. They describe this gigantic wave coming very far inland and killing everybody except those who were up on the mountain tops. And they actually name all the different locations where people survived, says Mr Hamacher. He and Mr Goff took core samples from locations between 500 metres and 1 kilometre inland, and at each spot they found a layer of ocean sediment about 2 metres down, indicating that a tsunami likely washed over the area hundreds or possibly thousands of years ago. The samples need further analysis, but Mr Hamacher says it is a very exciting result that suggests the legend could be true. Earlier this year, another team of researchers presented a paper arguing that stories from Australia's coastal Aboriginal communities might represent genuine and unique observations of sea level rises that occurred between 7,000 and 11,000 years ago. Nick Reed, a linguistics expert from the University of New England in Australia, co-authored the paper with marine geographer Patrick Nunn from the University of the Sunshine Coast. The stories they analysed, which have been documented in colonial times, referred to water levels rising over coastal areas that were once dry. By looking at historical records of sea level rise following the last glacial period, about 20,000 years ago, they were able to match the stories to coinciding dates. Mr Reid says the relative isolation of Australia's Indigenous people, living for 50,000 or more years free from cultural disruptions, and the conservative nature of their culture could explain why there is so much detail in their stories. Aboriginal people have very particular beliefs about the importance of telling stories properly, and about stories being told by the right people, he says. They also employ a rigid kin-based cross-generational system of fact-checking stories, involving grandchildren, parents and elders, which Mr Reid said doesn't seem to be used by other cultures. This extreme conservatism and adherence to accuracy can also be seen in rock paintings, drawings and engravings, which were often used to support oral legends, says Les Bursell, an anthropologist and member of Sydney's Dharawal people. They also replicated time after time after time, and if they vary, even by not very much at all, they are scraped off and redone, he says. Mr Bursell doesn't think Aboriginal communities are interested in sharing their knowledge with modern Australia. Non-Indigenous academics recognise that some Aboriginal communities are suspicious of outsiders. But Mr Hamacher says his research group has been approached by a number of Aboriginal communities keen to tell their stories. He says this sharing must be met with a giving back process that benefits the Indigenous community. His team, for instance, has developed a range of educational materials relating to astronomy which are now being taught in remote schools. It is all part of a growing recognition that Indigenous knowledge has a lot to offer the scientific community. Australia's National Science Organisation, the Commonwealth Scientific and Industrial Research Organisation, or the CSIRO, is working with Indigenous communities to improve environmental management practices in order to prevent wildfires and improve ecological health and biodiversity. But there is a problem. Indigenous languages are dying off at an alarming rate, making it increasingly difficult for scientists and other experts to benefit from such knowledge. More than 100 languages have already become extinct since white settlement. About 145 Indigenous languages are still spoken in Australia by at least one person. But a 2014 report by the Australian Institute of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Studies found that 75% of these were considered critically endangered. And a couple of stories from the paranormal.about.com website. The first one is Legend of the Accident Ghost, and it's by Dave P. Several years ago, my wife and I were travelling a lonely stretch of highway between New York and Vermont. It was 3 a.m. There were no houses, no street lights, just pitch black outside. We were anxious to get home, so even though the speed limit was 55, I was doing around 65. All of a sudden in the blackness, there was a ghost white face of a young man with black curly hair right in front of my windshield. His face was brightly lit by my headlights. He looked frightened and was waving his arms frantically in front of him. There was no way I could avoid hitting the young man. My wife and I both screamed, cringed and braced for impact. But nothing happened. There was no impact, and yet I was doing 65 miles per hour. How could I have not hit him? I slowed the car down and stopped. I asked my wife if she had seen the young man. She had seen him plain as day, just as I did. We both jumped out of the car, expecting to see someone lying on the road somewhere. I took out my huge spotlight flashlight and shined it up and down the road, but there was nothing there. No one was lying in the road anywhere. We even walked up and down both sides of the highway, shining my spotlights into the woods, but we still saw nothing. We had to leave, but I told my wife that I was stopping at the first police station we saw because I was sure that something awful had happened. We drove about 12 more miles and finally came to a state police station. I pulled in and my wife and I went in and explained what happened. The two state policemen that I was telling our story to began looking at each other with smirks on their faces. Now I'm thinking that they don't believe me, so I stopped talking and just stared at them. One of the policemen said, "Oh, I'm sorry, we didn't mean to laugh. But what you saw was our local legend. About 15 years ago, a young man fitting your description was travelling that lonely highway alone in the dark. His tyre blew, and he tried to frantically flag down the first vehicle to come along. That vehicle was an 18-wheeler, and the truck driver could not stop. The young man was struck and killed that night. Now, every so often, nighttime travellers see the young man still trying to flag someone down to help him." My wife and I left the police station with a mix of emotions. We were happy we hadn't hit anyone on that dark and lonely road. We felt awful for the young man who apparently relives that horror over and over again. But we were also completely freaked out. We never believed in ghosts, but we do now. Evil in a Diner Restroom by Michael G. This story may sound unbelievable, but I promise you that it is 100% true. It did not actually happen to me, but rather my friend who was only a few feet away from me. This occurred in a truck stop diner somewhere in Mississippi in May 1988. My friend and I were travelling through Mississippi on our way to Arkansas, and we stopped at a diner for dinner. While we were waiting for our food to come, my friend decided to go to the men's room to wash his hands. That was all he had to do, was wash his hands, because my friend is a very hygienic person. As my friend approached the men's room door, a horrible smell emanated from the restroom, despite the door being closed. My friend felt a surge of adrenaline course through his body. Surely the air inside the restroom was unbreathable, but he had to wash his hands before he ate because he recently touched a fuel pump. Perhaps I can hold my breath long enough to wash my hands, he reasoned in his mind. He pushed the door open, and what he next saw and heard caused him to panic. Beneath the walls of a stall, my friend saw a pair of feet move downward, as if to brace the floor. He then heard an horrific groan, a groan that could be likened to that of a lost soul being cast into the lake of fire. The groan was immediately followed by an equally loud body noise and subsequent plonking of water. My friend was not breathing at this moment, but he could feel the danger all around him. There was no way for him to draw a breath, yet he needed to wash his hands on this one single visit to this restroom of evil. As quick as he could, he moved to the sink and turned on the water. Just then another loud groan came from the stall, followed by a body noise and plonking of water. My friend washed his hands as quickly as he could, but despite how frightening this encounter was, the experience became even worse. My friend quickly realised that the faucet knobs were covered with a greasy substance that appeared to be lard. Personally, I suspected it was ectoplasm, but there's no way to prove that now. My friend struggled to get the grease off his hands as quickly as he could. He felt the life draining from his body and desperately needed oxygen. Another groan came from the stall. My friend quickly looked, and those feet were once again bracing the floor. Then came the body noise. Then came the plonk. Naturally, my friend felt like he was now in hell. Only a moment before passing out, he was able to make his way out of this horrible place and finally inhale. He sat down at the table in the diner and told me about what he had just gone through. I felt like that I had just dodged a bullet. We were far from home and we had no idea who to report this to. Many years have passed now and we're both still haunted by the memory of this event. To this day, my friend is afraid to wash his hands in a strange bathroom. To this day, I am so grateful that I chose not to wash my hands on that fateful night. For you see, I too am a very hygienic person, and I too normally wash my hands before I eat. The music for today's podcast came from the musicalley.com. The bandwidth is provided by TalkShoe at www.talkshoe.com. The show notes are kept at the Origins podcast website, origins.info. And of course we have a Facebook page, facebook.com/Paul Rexy, or just click on the link at the show notes. And I'd like to say a big thank you to these people who have given me a donation towards the upkeep of the podcast over the last week or so. Jeff Chapman, Scott McClory, Robert Sieg, Sean Yarnell, Luke Hewsome, Uriel Correa, Jean Park and David Glassy. Thank you everyone, your help is greatly appreciated. Six months after Henry VIII died in 1547, a full inventory of all the possessions of Henry VIII's crown was commissioned in London. Now housed in the British Library, the inventory took 18 months to complete and listed tens of thousands of individual items. From castles and ships to more than 3,500 gold and silver trinkets, as well as Henry's enormous collection of 2,000 tapestries. Also making the list, however, were a handful of more bizarre objects, including an orchestra's worth of musical instruments, experimental weapons, and one of the largest suits of armour in British royal history. Add to that some of the incredible gifts Henry received from fellow rulers during his lifetime, as well as some of the surprising personal items he commissioned for his own use while on the throne. And arguably the most famous king in British history owned some very unusual curiosities indeed. From the mentalfloss.com website, a story by Paul Anthony Jones. 9 bizarre objects owned by Henry VIII. A set of purple velvet bagpipes. Although he probably didn't write Greensleeves, Henry was nevertheless a talented musician and composer, and he was able to play the organ, the lute, the flute, and the virginal, an early form of harpsichord. Most of Henry's personal collection of musical instruments was housed at Westminster Palace in London, where they were maintained by a Flemish-born composer named Philip van Wilder, who was given the title of Keeper of the King's Instruments. Henry's 1547 inventory lists more than 20 recorders, 19 viols, 2 clavichords, and 4 sets of bagpipes, including one made of purple velvet with ivory pipework. A bowling alley. Shortly after the birth of his son Edward, later the short-lived King Edward VI, in 1537, Henry had a bowling alley built at Hampton Court Palace on the outskirts of London. Almost 200 feet long, It was more than 3 times the length of a modern 10-pin bowling alley. Bowling was a hugely popular pastime in Tudor England, at least until Henry's daughter, Queen Mary I, outlawed the keeping of any bowling alleys, dicing houses or other unlawful games in 1555. A Scavenger's Daughter. The Scavenger's Daughter was a gruesome and brutal instrument of torture invented sometime during Henry VIII's reign by Sir Leonard Skevington, the Lieutenant of the Tower of London. The device consisted of an A-shaped iron brace, inside of which a victim would be made to sit in a crouched position with their head touching their knees, and their wrists and ankles and neck shackled in place. An iron bar passed through the top of the A-frame would then be tightened like a vice, crushing the victim with excruciating force, apparently until the eyes, nose and even ears began to bleed. The Scavenger's Daughter was intended to be an alternative to the rack, which stretched its victims rather than compacting them. But unlike the rack, it mercifully seems to have only been used occasionally. A marmoset. By all accounts, Henry VIII loved animals. He kept ferrets, hawks, falcons and numerous other birds. The windows at Hampton Court were surrounded by cages containing canaries and nightingales, and owned dozens of dogs during his lifetime. After his death, more than 60 dog leashes were found in his wardrobe. By far Henry's most unusual pet, however, was a marmoset he received as a Christmas present in the late 1530s. Coincidentally, his first wife, Catherine of Aragon, also had a pet marmoset, and was even painted with it earlier that decade. But are these the strangest royal pets on record? Oddly enough, they aren't. In 1252, King Henry III was given a polar bear by the Norwegian King Haakon IV, which was housed at the Tower of London and kept on an enormous leash long enough to allow it to swim in the River Thames. A codpiece large enough to conceal a weapon. Henry VIII is credited with popularising the peculiar Tudor fashion for enormous, exaggerated codpieces, which during his reign established themselves as symbols of a man's virility and masculinity. The king, of course, had to have the biggest codpiece of all, and toward the end of his life, Henry's codpieces became roomy enough for him to use them as glorified pockets, in which he would keep jewels and other valuables and even small weapons. He even had them built into his armour. A mace pistol. This monstrous-looking device is called a mace pistol, although in Henry's day it was nicknamed the Holy Water Sprinkler or the King's Walking Staff. Now housed in the Royal Armouries in Leeds, England, the weapon was comprised of a pronged mace concealing 3 gun barrels in its spiked head. Henry apparently had a habit of wandering the streets of London at night, brandishing his walking staff in order to check that his constables were doing their work properly. However, one night he was arrested for carrying a weapon by one of his men who failed to recognise him, and ended up spending a night in a prison cell. When the constable recognised his error the following day, he presumed the king would have him immediately executed, but instead Henry granted him a handsome raise, and supplied all the prisoners with whom he had spent the night a supply of coal and bread. A pair of football boots. Records show that in 1526, Henry VIII commissioned a pair of leather football boots at a cost of 4 shillings, or about $130 today. 14 years later, in 1540, he banned football on the grounds that it incited riots. A suit of armour with a 51-inch waist. A suit of armour made for Henry, 5 years into his reign in 1514, showed that the 23-year-old king was 6'1", and had an athletic 32-inch waist and a 39-inch chest. 25 years of a king's diet later, a suit of armour Henry had made for a May Day tournament in 1540, when he was 49 years old, showed that he now required a 51-inch waist and a 54.5-inch chest. And finally, a horned helmet. This bespectacled, demon-faced horned helmet was presented to Henry VIII by the Holy Roman Emperor Maximilian I in 1514, along, tragically, with the rest of a now lost suit of armour. After Henry's death in 1547, his court jester, Will Somers, apparently took over possession of it and most likely incorporated it into his act. From the creepypasta.com website, a story by Benlala. Bound. Paul pulled the envelope out of his leather attaché case and settled into an uncomfortable chair behind a large writing desk. Late afternoon sun filtered in through the bay window, but couldn't defeat the dankness of the old house, nor the dreariness of his mood. Luckily he had had the mind to pack a few battery-powered lanterns, and one of them now provided enough illumination to examine his mother's ornate handwriting on the back of the envelope. For Paul, it read. He traced the letters with his fingers, each one written with care and love. Pensively he squeezed the bridge of his nose and released an exhausted breath. He had admittedly taken the loss of his mother very hard, as she was a kind, bright, thoughtful woman taken away before her time. But he was a lucky man, and had married a woman who exuded those same qualities, and had been blessed with a daughter whose genes seemingly came from the women in his family. He had received the envelope several weeks before at the allocation of his mother's will. Its content undoubtedly was a letter, most likely full of sage advice and love. He had agonised over opening it, though, as he was unable to come to terms with the reading of his mother's final words. But his wife Lauren had finally convinced him that they might provide comfort rather than sadness. With final resolve he retrieved a dusty letter opener from the desk and began to read the hand-written letter. To my dearest Paul, there are not enough words in the dictionary to express my love for you, Lauren, and your sweet baby Emily. I only hope that I have shown you that love over your 25 years of life. My health may be fading, but know that I will always be with you, and that I'm sorry for what I'm about to reveal to you. I fear, though, that there isn't enough forgiveness on God's green earth for what I've done. If you are reading this, that means that my final will and testament have been executed, and you are probably surprised to find that you are now the owner of a small farmhouse in Creekside, Pennsylvania. It is the house that I grew up in. Heed my words, Paul. Do not go to that house. Put the deed in the back of your safe. Claim it as an asset, but otherwise forget that it exists. You may be curious to see the childhood home of your mother, but please do not go to that house. I'm going to tell you why, Paul, and you may not have the same respect for me afterwards, but it is imperative that you understand the gravity of the situation. My parents and I moved from that house when I was around 15 to live with Aunt June. However, when I was a few years younger than you are now, fresh out of college, I was offered a teaching position at a school a few towns over from that childhood home. You know, my parents both passed away shortly after we had moved to California, and now I'm telling you that they too had left me that house in their will. But they never provided me with the knowledge I'm about to bestow upon you, my poor, sweet Paul. Out of convenience, I moved into the house several weeks before summer ended. The town hadn't changed much. It was still secluded, surrounded by forest, and its residents were still fairly strange and private. They did remember who I was, though, and they definitely remembered the accident that caused my family to leave. As I was buying some groceries, the woman behind the counter recognised me and told me that I shouldn't have come back, and strongly suggested I should turn around and leave right there and then. She grabbed me by the hand forcefully to express her urgency. There was a scar on her arm, just like the one I bear. The one I told you I got from falling off my bike as a little girl. I was admittedly a little freaked out, but not enough to take her advice. That whole town is a little kooky, and at the time I thought I was being shunned for what happened when I was a teenager. But there was a fearfulness in her tone that has sat with me all these years. The house had remained untouched for 8 years, and I spent that first day cleaning a thin film of dust off of everything. I was exhausted by nightfall, and feeling that it was awkward to sleep in my parents' old bedroom, I opted for my old one on the first floor. Because my room was small, my bed was flush against the wall, partially covering the only window in its length. A dresser and vanity were against the parallel wall. I remember collapsing into that bed that night, my body aching from moving boxes and cleaning. I'm not sure what initially woke me up that night, Paul. I don't recall a noise that pulled me from my slumber, but I was overwhelmed by a feeling that I was not alone. Moonlight through the window cast shadows, but after a quick scan I knew the room was devoid of life, save for me. And then I saw it, in the vanity mirror, a reflection of the window, and looking in through the window was a creature that should not exist. That cannot be from this world, too horrible for words. Just know, Paul, that this thing was evil. Even in the pale light you could see the vile intentions in its inky eyes and snarling, fanged mouth. It looked excited and hungry, its grey hands pressed against the glass, each elongated alien finger leaving a filmy residue behind as it dragged its claw-like nails down the window. My back was turned to it, my feet only a few inches away from its face, separated by a thin pane of glass. I watched it feverishly watch me through the mirror. Unable to tell if it was aware that I knew it was there, I nonetheless felt like it was waiting for me to move. I, however, was frozen with fear. Honestly, if something by the grace of God hadn't stirred me from my sleep, the sound of its screeching nails would have woken me. I was able to quell a surprised reaction and remained still. Maybe it was minutes, maybe it was hours, but the thing finally left. I'd be lying to you if I told you that that was the first time I ever saw it, though. I'm so sorry, Paul. There are 3 creeks that run parallel in the woods that surround the town, a few miles apart from one another. Of all the rules given to us, the children of Creekside, the most important one was that we were not allowed to pass the second creek, and we were strongly urged not to venture too far past the first one. My parents told me that there were old foundations and wells that made it dangerous for us kids to play there, and that several children had gone missing in the woods. But it was apparent that the adults of the town never crossed the second creek either. A few people who had risked getting close to the second creek claimed they had seen ghosts among the trees, and that law alone was enough to convince us kids to stay close to town. My best friends growing up were Jimmy and Andy. Jimmy, you know, would later become your father, but Andy was a bit of a daredevil and troublemaker, and I was an impressionable young girl. One day Andy had stolen a few of his dad's cigarettes, and the 3 of us went into the woods like a bunch of stupid hard-asses to smoke them. Andy got the crazy idea that we needed to rebel even more and explore the woods past the second creek. Jimmy and I were scared, for it had been so ingrained into us to never do it, but Andy was persuasive. Andy crossed the ancient-looking bridge over the second creek first, cigarette in his mouth. Jimmy and I delayed across from him. It became clear that Jimmy wasn't going to do it. He threw a rock at Andy, called him an idiot, and started walking up the path towards town. I begged Andy to come back with us, and I must have thrown my head back in frustration when he teased me. That's when I saw it, the grey gargoyle-like creature. It was perched in a tree, not too far away from where Andy was standing. It looked like a vulture eyeing its prey. I had barely started to scream when it leapt from the tree and tackled Andy to the ground. Jimmy ran back to my side, but neither of us had any idea what to do, let alone how to comprehend the fear. I could hear Andy screaming and fighting, and I swear, Paul, that sound has never left my ears. I grabbed a rock and ran across the bridge. I hit the thing over the head, but it swiftly knocked me back into the water. I struggled, but Jimmy pulled me out on the other side, just in time to see the creature make off with Andy's limp body through the trees. I don't know how long Jimmy and I sat there in shock, but the stars were out when we reached my house. We told our worried parents and the other adults who had gathered there our story. All of them seemed more shocked that Andy and I had crossed the creek, rather than by descriptions of the creature. Jimmy's mum let out a cry of relief when she realised her boy had not crossed. But my parents started packing up loose belongings and clothing hastily. We left the town that night and drove the whole way to Aunt June's, only stopping once outside of Chicago. My parents died only 6 months later from a disease that doctors couldn't identify. I was young and didn't understand. Everything was a blur, and I couldn't discern one emotion and memory from another. At some point I started believing that Andy had fallen in the creek and hit his head on a rock, and that my parents' passing was an awful coincidence. It was easier to cope that way. And then I saw that hideous face in the window, like it had claimed me nearly a decade before, and had been waiting for me ever since. I was relieved when it left, but fearful, for I did not know where it had gone. I remained frozen the rest of the night. Early the next morning a knock came from the front door. I hesitated, gripped again by fear, but it was Jimmy. A nostalgic reunion was halted by his urgency to discuss something with me. I knew what it was before he even sat at the kitchen table. I wasn't prepared for what he was about to tell me, though, Paul. I'll spare you the details and tell you only what you need to know. This thing that lives in the woods has been there for a really long time, Jimmy says, far before the original settlement of Creekside. Nobody knows exactly where it came from or much else about it, only that it was responsible for the vicious deaths of many of the town's children. It likes young blood, Jimmy told me. Nobody could figure out a way to kill it either. But the thing was conniving and sentient, and realised that if the people left, its food would too. On the other hand, the townspeople feared that wherever they went, the creature would follow. So a deal had been made in blood. Anything that moved between the oval the second and third creek created belonged to the creature, and in turn the creature would never harm anything that didn't cross that boundary. Jimmy told me I belonged to the creature because I had crossed the bridge, and my parents had been killed because they betrayed the pact. You see, Paul, it's a curse. I know it's hard to believe. It didn't take me long to make the decision to leave Creekside again. Jimmy didn't know definitively what geographically bound the creature, but had done enough research to estimate that it only travelled within the confines of Creekside and nearby townships. He had also discovered similar tales of creatures around the world. These things are all over the place, and I'm sorry, Paul, this is not important now. Check the files within your father's study, they'll tell you more than you need to know. Don't delve too deep, though. It was his obsession with it that cost him his life, not the car accident I lied to you about. I'm so sorry. Jimmy helped me throw a few boxes into my car and promised to meet me again soon. I turned around the last time to share a moment of silent solitude with him before I got into my car. As I turned back, I could see terror transform his face. He called my name, but I didn't have appropriate time to react. The creature bounded from the woods and leapt to the roof of my car. It crouched, dropping its face to be even with mine. Sneering, its rancid breath smelled of dried blood. My knees weakened and buckled as Jimmy swooped in to tackle the thing off of the roof. Jimmy fought with all his might, but wasn't a match, and ended up crumpled, a few feet away from me. In hysterics I tried to flee, but quickly found I had nowhere to run. The thing caught me promptly, and dragged me into the woods with little effort. Jimmy composed himself enough to start running after us, screaming for me to make a deal. I lost consciousness before I could make sense of what Jimmy was telling me, a fleeting memory of Andy whispering in my mind. Paul, please remember how much I love you as you struggle to manage the final parts of my story. A small fire blinded me as I awoke on cold, damp ground, surrounded by trinkets of time gone by. An old, wind-up children's toy, a few dog collars, Andy's engraved lighter. Bones were littered everywhere. The creature sat squat across from me, watching me zealously. It was muttering anxiously and rocking on its wolfish feet. I was surprised, as ancient as Jimmy told me this thing was, to find that it spoke English. "Spoiled," it said gravely. "You spoiled." I remember its coal eyes following me as I nervously brought myself to a sitting position. I knew it was you, too old now, spoiled. I seemed to be in a cavern of some sort with two tunnels that faded to blackness, neither discernible as the exit. I haven't forgotten its words, nor the look in its eyes when it stopped rocking. You can't leave. You are mine. You belong to me. You crossed the water, but you are too old to eat. You spoiled. Realising the thing was contemplating over whether to kill me or not, Jimmy's screams strained through my head, and I understand that he had meant for me to make a deal with the creature for my life. The creature liked a bargain, so I asked it, Paul, what it wanted in exchange for letting me go. It thought a while before it smiled maliciously. It wanted one of my children, and one of my children's children. I wondered if this thing had been around long enough to inspire Rumpelstiltskin. I don't know, Paul, but I took that deal. I nodded my head and agreed that when I had children, I would bring one of them to the creature, and if I had grandchildren, I would sacrifice one of them as well. It might seem like a rough bargain, but it would get two for letting one go. You might be sickened now, Paul, to realise that after considering the offer thoughtfully, I simply intended just to never have children. I resolved to give up becoming a mother. I thought I had tricked it. The creature took my hand, cutting its claw deep into my forearm, creating a brand that would bond me for life. Then it simply let me go. Jimmy and several others he had gathered waited at the bridge. None of them asked me how I survived, for they all knew by the scarlet letter on my arm. As you know, Jimmy would leave Creekside and settle with me near Aunt June in California. On good conscience, I couldn't sell the house and put another family in the vicinity of that evil thing. I had become resigned to the fact that I had to abandon the opportunity of motherhood, but could never bring myself to permanently and medically destroy the chance of pregnancy. I just couldn't do it, Paul. And Jimmy and I were careful even after we married. But several years later I became pregnant with you and your twin brother Andrew. I know that's a shock. I'm not proud of what I did, Paul, and I regret never telling you about your brother. I knew, though, that the creature would take me as it did my parents if I betrayed our deal. The scar on my arm burned long before I gave birth to you. I took that baby, Paul, that infant only a few days old. I took him back to Creekside and left him on the other side of the bridge on the second creek. I am unworthy of forgiveness, and to this day the memory induces nausea and unbearable heartbreak. It was an evil thing for me to do, but it let me watch you grow up into the man you are. I've given you every ounce of goodness I could, and that's why I'm dying, Paul. I knew Lauren was with child a month before you announced it because the scar on my arm was on fire, reminding me of my dues. I can't pay them this time. I can't do that to you or sweet Emily. I have lived my life, and only hope that I can be reunited with your father and Andrew on the other side. I fear that my actions have provided for more insidious consequences, however. I will repeat my initial warning, Paul. Do not go to that house in Creekside. Only evil waits there. I can't bear to imagine if the creature is able to reach Emily, our sweet, sweet Emily. I love you, Paul, with my whole heart. I am so sorry, but do not deserve your forgiveness. Mum. Paul put the letter down on the writing desk. He could not distinguish disturbed and disgusted emotions amongst a primal fear and sadness. He couldn't categorise and understand his thoughts. He was unable to tell if these emotions were targeted towards his mother or himself. His mother had made some awful and anguishing decisions, sure, but he probably should have read the letter before he brought his wife and daughter to this place. Suddenly his mother's childhood house seemed a little darker. Dazed, he desperately tried to grasp the connotations of his mother's letter. The sound of glass smashing broke his stupor, the sound of glass shattering, the ferocity of his wife's screams, and the fading wail of his daughter's cry.